She thought she knew everything about him, his hat, his beliefs, his entire story. In a moment of anger, she humiliated him in front of everyone. But what she didn't know was the truth about the man behind the hat. And when she found out, it changed her life forever. The scene cuts to James calmly dusting off his hat, his quiet words echoing, "You have no idea who I really am." Never underestimate simplicity. Sometimes, the most unassuming people hold the greatest strength. Comments below where you're watching from, and if you like and love our story, kindly subscribe our channel. Life, inspirational, and motivational tales that explore themes of love, unity, and patriotism. Stay with us always for interesting stories. Thanks. Let's start the story. The morning sun bathed the bustling town center in a warm glow, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. Vendors arranged their displays. The aroma of freshly baked bread mingled with the crisp autumn air, and pedestrians moved about their day with quiet purpose. Among the crowd was James Preston, a man in his 70s whose gentle smile had become a fixture of the community. His well-worn MAGA hat rested proudly atop his head, a simple yet bold statement of his beliefs. James's day began the same way it always did, with a leisurely stroll to the local cafe. He greeted every passerby with a nod or a kind word, stopping occasionally to chat with familiar faces. His warmth seemed almost contagious, drawing smiles even from strangers. As he pushed open the cafe door, the small bell above jingled and the barista behind the counter greeted him cheerfully. "Morning, Mr. Preston," she said, setting down a steaming cup of black coffee, already prepared just the way he liked it. "Good morning, Emma," James replied, his voice steady and calm. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" James took his usual seat by the window, where he could watch the world pass by. He sipped his coffee slowly, his gaze resting on the lively scene outside. It was a peaceful moment, one of the few luxuries he allowed himself in a life filled with quiet routines and unassuming kindness. Not far away, Rachel Hayes moved briskly through the crowd. Her sharp eyes scanned the street, taking in the sights and sounds of the morning rush. Rachel, in her early 30s, was a woman of strong convictions and even stronger opinions. Her life had been shaped by her experiences and the passionate causes she championed. She prided herself on speaking her mind, no matter the circumstances. As she walked past the cafe, Rachel's gaze landed on James through the window. Her steps slowed, her brow furrowing, as her eyes fixed on the bright red MAGA hat he wore. A wave of irritation surged through her. To Rachel, the hat symbolized division and intolerance, ideas she had spent years fighting against. Without hesitating, Rachel pushed open the cafe door and strode toward James. Her presence disrupted the calm atmosphere, drawing curious glances from nearby patrons. Standing in front of him, she crossed her arms and addressed him with a voice that carried both frustration and conviction. "Do you really think wearing that hat makes any sense in this day and age?" she demanded, her tone sharp and accusatory. James looked up at her, his expression a mix of surprise and quiet patience. "Good morning," he said softly, setting down his coffee cup. "How can I help you?" Rachel's eyes narrowed. "You can help by taking that hat off. People like you are the reason this country is so divided." The cafe fell silent, the hum of conversation replaced by the quiet tension of the unfolding confrontation. A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others watched with undisguised interest. James remained seated, his posture calm and unthreatening. "I'm sorry if my hat offends you," he said, his voice steady. "But it's a symbol of what I believe in, and I have no intention of taking it off." Rachel's frustration boiled over. She reached out and snatched the hat from his head, holding it up as if it were evidence in a courtroom. "This isn't about beliefs. It's about the harm people like you cause," she said, throwing the hat onto the ground. James's face tightened, the hurt in his eyes unmistakable. Yet he didn't raise his voice or lash out. Instead, he leaned down, picked up the hat and dusted it off with slow, deliberate movements. Standing up, he looked Rachel in the eyes and spoke with quiet dignity. "You have no idea who I really am," he said, his words hanging in the air like a challenge and a plea all at once. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but the intensity of his gaze silenced her. Without another word, James placed the hat back on his head, turned, and walked out of the cafe, leaving behind a room filled with uneasy silence. James stepped out of the cafe, the crisp air brushing against his face as he placed the MAGA hat back on his head. His steps were slow and steady, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jacket. He didn't look back at the cafe or the people who had watched the scene unfold. Instead, he focused on moving forward, his calm exterior masking the sting he felt inside. Mark Sullivan, the cafe owner, stood at the counter, having witnessed the entire exchange. A broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a warm demeanor, Mark had known James for years. He had seen the elderly man's kindness, his quiet contributions to the community, and his steadfast resilience in the face of life's hardships. Mark couldn't let this moment pass. Leaving his post behind the counter, Mark followed James out onto the street. "James," he called softly, jogging a few steps to catch up. "Wait a second." James paused, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he turned to face his friend. "Ah, Mark, I'm sorry for the commotion back there," he said, his tone apologetic. "Didn't mean to cause a scene." Mark shook his head. "You didn't cause anything. That woman, Rachel, I think her name is, she was out of line. Are you okay?" James offered a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine. Some people see the hat and assume they know everything about me. It's not worth getting angry over." Mark studied his friend for a moment, sensing there was more beneath the surface. "You got a lot more patience than most, James. But maybe it's time people knew a bit more about the man behind the hat." James's smile grew, a flicker of warmth returning. "Maybe. But not today." As they spoke, Rachel Hayes was recounting the incident to her friends at a nearby cafe. She gestured animatedly, her words tumbling out in a rush of conviction. "I mean, you should have seen him, just sitting there with that smug little hat. How could I not say something? People like him, they're the reason we're stuck in this mess." One of her friends, a woman named Megan, frowned slightly. "Do you really think confronting him like that was the best way to handle it?" Rachel folded her arms, her expression resolute. "Someone has to stand up to these people. Silence is complicity, Megan. If we don't call them out, nothing will ever change." Another friend, Carl, leaned back in his chair. "But do you even know who he is? I mean, what if there's more to his story?" Rachel hesitated, her confidence wavering for a brief moment. "It doesn't matter who he is. That hat says enough. It's a symbol of everything I fought against." Her voice softened as she added, "You all know what I've been through. The harassment, the threats. People who wore hats like that have made my life miserable." The group fell quiet, the weight of Rachel's words settling over them. It was clear her actions were fueled not just by ideology but by personal pain. Yet even her closest friends seemed uneasy with the way she had handled the situation. Meanwhile, James continued his walk through town, his usual route taking him toward the community center. As he approached the building, he paused to greet a familiar face. The town's mayor, Eleanor Brooks, stood outside, a clipboard in hand and a warm smile on her face. "James," she said, her tone bright. "Perfect timing. I was just about to call you." James chuckled softly. "Eleanor, you've always had impeccable timing. What can I do for you?" As they spoke, their conversation was casual, almost unremarkable to anyone passing by. But those who knew James understood the significance of his relationship with the mayor. Over the years, he had quietly advised her on countless initiatives, his wisdom and experience shaping policies that had improved countless lives in the community. From across the street, Mark watched the interaction with a knowing smile. He had long suspected that James's unassuming demeanor hid a lifetime of remarkable achievements. Few people knew the full extent of what James had done, and fewer still would believe it if they were told. But to Mark, moments like this were a reminder of just how extraordinary his friend truly was. As James and the mayor parted ways, a sense of calm settled over him. Whatever had happened in the cafe, it was behind him now. There was work to be done, and he wasn't the kind of man to dwell on negativity. Back at her table, Rachel felt a nagging sense of unease. Her friend's questions and the look she had seen on the faces of the cafe patrons replayed in her mind. For the first time, she wondered if she had judged James too quickly. But the thought was fleeting, buried beneath the weight of her convictions and the walls she had built around her beliefs. The next morning, Rachel scrolled idly through her phone, her coffee growing cold on the table beside her. The events of the previous day lingered in her mind, though she tried to push them away. She told herself she had done the right thing, standing up for what she believed in. But an unfamiliar unease gnawed at her, a faint whisper of doubt she couldn't quite ignore. As she swiped through her social media feed, a headline caught her eye. "Local hero, the untold story of James Preston." Her thumb hovered over the screen, her heart skipping a beat. Clicking on the link, she was greeted by an article accompanied by a photo of the elderly man she had confronted the day before. He stood in front of a modest building, his MAGA hat perched firmly on his head. A group of smiling children clustered around him. Rachel read the article with growing disbelief. James Preston, it explained, had lived a life most people could only dream of. He was a decorated war hero, having served in the military during a particularly tumultuous period, where his bravery had earned him several commendations. After retiring, he had quietly dedicated his life to philanthropy. The article detailed his efforts to save a struggling local orphanage, using his own savings to keep its doors open when funding had dried up. He had also established a scholarship fund for underprivileged students, ensuring that dozens of young people had access to education they otherwise couldn't afford. The writer described James as a man of unwavering principles, someone who believed in unity and kindness above all else. He wears his hat, not as a symbol of division, the article read, but as a reminder of the ideals he holds dear: perseverance, hope, and the belief that we can all do better. Rachel's stomach twisted as she finished reading. The comments below the article were filled with gratitude and admiration for James, people sharing stories of how his generosity and wisdom had touched their lives. The stark contrast between his character and the assumptions she had made about him the day before was impossible to ignore. She set her phone down, staring blankly at the table. The memory of James's calm, hurt expression replayed in her mind, his quiet words echoing louder than they had the day before. "You have no idea who I really am." Rachel's hands trembled as she picked up her coffee, but the drink offered no comfort. The guilt was a heavy weight pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. For years she had prided herself on being a person who fought for justice and fairness, but now she saw how blind her actions had been. She had humiliated a man she knew nothing about, reducing his identity to a single symbol and a set of assumptions. The unease grew too heavy to bear. Determined to make sense of her swirling emotions, Rachel decided to find out more about James. She couldn't undo what she had done, but perhaps understanding him better could be a first step toward making things right. Her first stop was a cafe. As she entered, the familiar scent of fresh coffee greeted her. But this time it offered no solace. Mark Sullivan stood behind the counter, his usual warm smile faltering slightly when he saw her. Rachel hesitated, then approached him, unsure of how to start. "Hi," she said, her voice quieter than usual. I'm Rachel. I think you saw what happened yesterday." Mark's expression grew serious, and he nodded. "I did." She shifted awkwardly, looking down at the counter. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. I didn't know who he was." Mark studied her for a moment before replying. "Not many people do. James doesn't go around advertising all the good he's done. He's not that kind of man." Rachel bit her lip, then asked, "Can you tell me more about him? I read an article, but I want to know what kind of person he really is." Mark's face softened. "You got a lot to learn, but I'll tell you what I can." He leaned on the counter, his tone shifting to one of fond recollection. "James has been coming to this cafe for as long as I've owned it. Never misses a morning unless he's sick, and even then, he calls to let me know he won't be here. He's always been the kind of guy who goes out of his way to make people feel welcome. You wouldn't believe how many times he's picked up someone's tab when they couldn't afford their coffee." Mark paused, then added, "You know that scholarship fund for kids who can't pay for college? That was him. He never put his name on it, but he's been funding it for years. And that orphanage just outside town? He was going to close down a few years back. James donated enough money to keep it open, then volunteered every week to help with repairs and spend time with the kids." Rachel listened, each story chipping away at the defensive wall she had built around herself. Mark's voice grew quieter as he continued. "He doesn't wear that hat to make a statement. To him, it's a reminder of everything he's fought for. It's not about politics. It's about his belief that people can still come together and make things better." Tears pricked Rachel's eyes as Mark finished speaking. She had come to the cafe expecting to learn a little more about James, but instead, she had been given a mirror to her own flaws. She realized how narrow her perspective had been, how quick she had been to judge someone without understanding their story. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I needed to hear that." Mark nodded, his expression kind. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what you do next." Rachel left the cafe, her mind racing. The weight of her guilt hadn't lifted, but it had shifted, becoming a drive to make amends. For the first time, she saw James not as an opponent, but as a person, a kind, selfless man whose life had been shaped by values far deeper than she had realized. The afternoon sun streamed through the wide windows of the local community center, casting warm golden light across the bustling activity within. Children's laughter echoed off the walls as they worked on crafts, played games, and shared stories. In the midst of the joyful chaos stood James Preston, his MAGA hat slightly askew, as he knelt to help a young boy glue the pieces of a paper airplane together. His movements were steady, his expression kind, as he patiently guided the boy's small hands. Rachel hesitated at the entrance, her nerves tightening with each passing second. She had spent the morning summoning the courage to come here, replaying the words she needed to say over and over in her mind. But now, standing on the threshold, she found herself frozen, watching James from a distance. He seemed so at ease, so genuinely connected to the world around him. It only deepened the guilt that had been gnawing at her since she had learned his story. Taking a deep breath, Rachel stepped forward. Her footsteps echoed faintly on the tiled floor as she approached him. James glanced up and saw her, his eyes briefly widening in surprise before settling into a calm, neutral gaze. He stood slowly, brushing off his hands and stepping away from the table of children. "Miss Hayes," he said softly, tilting his head slightly, "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Rachel's cheeks flushed. "Mr. Preston, I came here because I owe you an apology." The room seemed to grow quieter, though the children continued their activities a few feet away. Rachel clasped her hands together, her voice trembling as she continued. "Yesterday, I acted out of anger and ignorance. I judged you without knowing anything about you. I thought I was standing up for something important, but I was wrong. I was wrong about you, about everything." James regarded her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, to her relief, he smiled. A gentle, understanding smile that seemed to ease the tightness in her chest. "We all make mistakes," he said, his voice steady and kind. "What matters is what we learn from them." Rachel felt a lump rise in her throat. She had braced herself for anger, for defensiveness, even for rejection. But James's forgiveness came so easily, so freely, that it only deepened her remorse. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're a better person than I could ever hope to be." James shook his head, gesturing for her to follow him to a quieter corner of the room. As they walked, he adjusted his hat absent-mindedly, his expression thoughtful. "Let me tell you something," he said once they were seated. "I've worn this hat for years. To some people it's just a piece of clothing. To others it's a symbol of division. But for me it's a reminder. It reminds me of the ideals I believe in: resilience, hope, and the belief that this country can always strive to be better." Rachel listened intently, her eyes fixed on him. James's voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of a lifetime of experiences. "I've seen this country at its best and its worst," he continued. "I've fought for it, worked for it, and I've seen how easily people can turn against each other over their differences. But I still believe in unity, in the idea that we can find common ground if we're willing to try." Rachel felt her chest tighten again, this time with a mixture of shame and admiration. "I thought I was standing up for what's right," she admitted, "but I didn't see the bigger picture. I let my own biases cloud my judgment." James nodded. "It's easy to do. We all carry our own experiences, our own hurts, and they shape how we see the world. But the key is to remember that everyone has a story. Everyone has a reason for the choices they make." Rachel looked down at her hands, her voice quieter now. "I've spent so much time fighting against what I thought was wrong that I forgot to look for what's good. I saw your hat and assumed I knew everything about you, I was wrong." James placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch light but reassuring. "What matters is that you're willing to learn. That's more than many people are willing to do." They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the children filling the space around them. Rachel glanced over at the group, watching as a little girl laughed with delight, holding up a brightly colored drawing for James to see. The simple joy in the scene made her heart ache. "I want to do better," Rachel said finally, her voice resolute. "I want to be better, and I want to make amends, not just to you but to others I've judged unfairly." James smiled again, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's a good place to start." Rachel stayed for a while, helping James with the children and getting to know the man she had so quickly dismissed the day before. As she worked alongside him, she saw firsthand the depth of his kindness and the quiet strength that defined him. By the time she left, the weight of her guilt had begun to lift, replaced by a newfound determination to approach the world with more empathy and understanding. As she walked home, Rachel reflected on the lessons James had taught her. She had come to the community center to apologize, but she had left with something far greater: a new perspective, a renewed sense of hope, and the realization that change begins not with grand gestures, but with small, meaningful steps toward understanding. News of Rachel's public apology to James and their unexpected reconciliation spread quickly through the small town. People who had witnessed the confrontation at the cafe shared the story with others, each retelling infused with awe at James's grace and Rachel's willingness to admit her mistake. Soon the tale was no longer about a hat or a disagreement. It became a symbol of something deeper: the power of understanding and forgiveness. In the days that followed, Rachel and James began working together on a project at the community center. The initiative, aimed at creating a mentorship program for underprivileged youth, brought them face to face with the challenges that truly mattered. Side by side, they organized events, raised funds, and spent hours listening to the hopes and struggles of the children they worked to support. Their collaboration, once unimaginable, became a living testament to the possibility of unity despite differing beliefs. Word of their efforts reached local media, and a reporter approached them for an interview. James, ever humble, downplayed his role, emphasizing instead the strength of the community and the importance of Rachel's decision to bridge the divide. Rachel, for her part, spoke candidly about her journey, how she had judged James without knowing him, and how the experience had changed her perspective. "It's easy to see someone as an opponent when you don't take the time to understand their story," she told the reporter. "James taught me that people are more than the symbols they carry. We all have our reasons, our histories, and our hopes. When we choose to listen, we find more that connects us than divides us." The article struck a chord with readers. Comments flooded in, many from people sharing their own stories of reconciliation and newfound understanding. The story became a beacon of hope in a time when division often seemed insurmountable. One evening, as Rachel walked home after a long day at the community center, she found herself reflecting on the transformation she had experienced. The town, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, felt quieter, more peaceful than it had in weeks. She thought about the children at the center, their laughter and determination, and about James's unshakable kindness and strength. She replayed his words in her mind, the line that had stayed with her since their first conversation at the community center: "The truth changes everything when you're willing to see it." It was a simple statement, but its depth resonated with her in a way nothing else ever had. For so long she had clung to her convictions, certain of what was right and wrong, who was good and bad. But James had shown her that the world wasn't so black and white. People were complex, their stories woven from threads of pain, hope, and resilience that couldn't be seen at a glance. As Rachel reached her doorstep, she paused and looked up at the sky, the stars faint but steady above her. She felt lighter than she had in years, her heart filled with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew there was still much work to be done, within herself and in the world around her. But she also knew she wasn't alone. James, the children, and the community had all become part of her journey, a reminder that change was possible when hearts and minds were open. Rachel smiled to herself, a quiet determination settling within her. She would carry James's lesson forward, sharing it with others in the hope that they too might see the truth and allow it to change everything. As the story wraps up, the narrator's voice returns, calm yet engaging, without tiring anymore, making the phrase appear soft and creamy. This story isn't just about a hat. It's about understanding forgiveness and seeing beyond the surface. Have you ever judged someone before knowing their story? Or maybe you've had a moment when someone surprised you with who they really were. Share your thoughts and real-life experiences in the comments below. Let's start a conversation because every story, including yours, has the power to inspire. Before you speak or act against someone, think twice. The person standing calmly, speaking kindly without anger or abuse, might be far more powerful and influential than they appear. Never underestimate simplicity. Sometimes, the most unassuming people hold the greatest strength. Comments below where you're watching from, and if you like and love our story, kindly subscribe our channel. Life, inspirational, and motivational tales that explore themes of love, unity, and patriotism. Stay with us always for interesting stories.